Lee of DonkeyJawProjects.com, and today we're going to talk about the role of narration in comic books. Once again, the Discord has served us with some very interesting conversation and just community. It's been really awesome. My buddy Russ has been in there, who's here with us right now. How you doing, Russ?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
And where can people find you, sir?
They can find me at russleach.com or comicbookblackbelt.com. You can pick me up at Comic Book Black Belt on YouTube. I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, the usual places. Just search on Russ Leach or on Comic Book Black Belt and you'll find me.
Awesome. And while you're there, sign up for the newsletter.
Yes, sign up for the newsletter. Thank you.
And of course, you can find my stuff at DonkeyJawProjects.com. I did already say that, but there is some free comics there if you sign up for my newsletter as well.
Good comments.
Thank you. And of course, Marshall Lee _DJP on Instagram and Twitter. Sir Handsome, as known in the Discord, has put an interesting video suggestion in the video suggestion section on Discord. And once again, you can sign up for that. There's a link down below. If anybody's having a hard time signing up for that, because somebody told me that the link expired and then I tested it seemed to work or whatever, so I'm not sure. But anyways, if you do, please let me know, because I don't want it to be sitting there, not working. So this Sir Handsome was saying that they were interested to hear a conversation about the narrative and storytelling and kind of its role, how like words and pictures work, and just this kind of idea, kind of like the differences between a prose story, like a regular like word novel or whatever, and a comic book. And they were basically saying that they feel like comic books sometimes they don't have enough narration, they don't have enough words in there, and it causes them to read a comic in like 5 minutes and then they're done and they didn't really have time to enjoy it. And I thought that was interesting. I've also heard people say kind of the opposite as well. What do you think about the difference or the kind of ratio from words to pictures and the role and how they interact in comics, Russ?
I think you've got two schools of thought, which is basically what you just alluded to. That on the one side, because it's not prose, because it's not a novel, sometimes you need a narrator to move the story along. I think old Marvel comics were quite good at that, and or the old Bronze Age comics were quite good at that. And I suppose it really depends how much you put into the art side of things as well, because the other school of thought, and I've come up against this with people as well, with other writers, is that the artwork should be doing a lot of the heavy lifting that you would normally do in a novel. So, for instance, pick up something like Lord of the Rings. The first half of the first book is all description, really, how beautiful the Shire is, their journey, and all the rest of it. In a comic, you would show that, show don't tell, and it's not just a writing thing; it's also a visual thing. So you would show the grandeur of the landscape and how that might affect you. And that puts a lot of weight on the shoulders of the artist, because if you're drawing books that are quite simple or simplistic in their art style, then I would suggest you probably need more narration and need more description. But obviously, if you're using an artist that does a lot of detail in the work, then maybe you don't need that. So it's definitely two schools of thought. And I think it works on both levels, to be honest. It's really dependent on the story and the team behind the work. But you do want to you do want to be satisfied by the time you finish a comic book. So if there's not a lot of words in there, I think the art really needs to fill in where the words aren't.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Very true. It's kind of weird because to me, I feel like you kind of stuck in a situation where it's like you kind of can't please everyone, when it comes to the ratio between the two. Because to me, the way when I read a comic, I do agree that it might be a little frustrating when um, you've read a comic in like 5 minutes and you're like, okay, well, that's that. For me, I would usually go back, especially if it's good art, I would go back and like kind of re-look at the art a little bit. There's that, but also there's it's not so bad when it's longer for like longer comics, like say reading a volume of manga.
Mm.
It'll a lot of times like the amount of pages it takes to tell a regular American comic issue, which would be like 20, 24 pages, they have like 100 and something pages in those. And so, you would actually get through a manga, especially like an action oriented manga. You would get through really quick, like 24 pages would probably take less than 5 minutes. But you get 120 pages, so it actually takes longer. So you feel like you're in the world for longer. So it's a little bit better in that respect. But, that's not always the case with American comics. And, so there's that. But there's like this whole interesting though thing with the difference between words and pictures. This person brings up a really good point because I tend to be the type of person who I've always liked the term show don't tell. And they say that a lot for especially novels and stuff, which is interesting because there is no pictures in novels generally, except for maybe a few here scattered in once in a while. But um, they talk about show don't tell, and usually that means like like you don't want too much exposition. You don't want to be kind of talking about how the world works and having people in, you want to put it in ways that work within the plot of the story, so the plot is moving on, and through the actions and through the dialogue you're getting all the information you need, as opposed to long descriptions of how the world works and things like that. But the same thing can kind of apply in comic books. Really, literally, you can literally show something instead of telling it. But there's certain things that can't be conveyed just in pictures, or they're harder, I should say, to convey in pictures. Especially when it comes to like the inner thoughts and emotions of the characters. A lot of times we've seen kind of word balloons go away. Sometimes they're swapped, with narration boxes or caption boxes or whatever. Um, and sometimes they're just gone altogether. And people sometimes approach comics like more like movies. And I feel like we have lost something sometimes when we do that, because the thing is comics is a really specific, like there's a certain dance between words and pictures that's really can be interesting, and if you use both to their fullest extent you can really do some interesting things. I do feel like it is possible that more narration in comics could be better. I'll tell you one thing though: when I flip through a comic and I see there's a lot of words, I usually don't want to buy that comic personally. That's me though. Not everybody's like that. Some people, they see word blocks of words like that and they're like, yes, I get to like spend some good time with this comic and I'm going to really like, I think I like what you said, Russ, like come out satisfied. So it's like
Mm.
that's the goal. You want your reader to come out satisfied, but the problem is not every reader is the same.
No, I agree 100%. You are sometimes shooting in the dark. But I think if you develop an audience, or if you have a certain set of people that will always buy the same book, then or the same type of book, then at least you've got a guide.
Mm,
It's always a scattergun approach right at the start of any new IP or new book, because you never know if it's going to please enough people. And so that's why so often you have fans of creators rather than just of IPs or just of stories, because of the way someone might write or the way someone might draw. I keep saying this, and I'll never shut up about it. I go back to the Bronze Age and I see a wonderful, for the most part, not always, but I see a wonderful balance of pictures and story. So you got enough that you really sort of got into it, and you got enough information and enough building through text of things like worlds and characters. I love narration boxes and I love thought boxes. And
mm,
my book I've just finished the script on has narration in it, and it has thought bubbles in it, because you don't say everything out loud, because sometimes people think you're mad if you do, and you often have an inner monologue. And that's the great thing about comics, is that it can kind of dive into the inner monologue of a character, but it's not a movie, so you you're restricted as to like facial expressions and what have you from one panel to the next, as against a smooth flow. But that's what comics are about. That's the great thing about them. It's that combination of text, story, and visuals, so that you don't have to read lots of exposition about, say, description about the environment that they're in, or the color of their clothes, or whether they've got a happy look on their face. You don't have to describe that. That's the artist's job. That's the artist's part of telling the story. But the exposition, I mean, I found this difficult working through my script, and I've got an editor looking at it at the moment, is you need to have some exposition. You're absolutely right. But people need to know what's going on. So, for instance, I had some history, some deep history, that needed to be understood for you to understand the context of the characters. So I had to dip into some of that as part of the conversation between the two protagonists, but not all at once. So you don't just have one page with like 20 bubbles of people, of this guy explaining exposition, because that's just boring. That's dull. So you have to think about it as to where you can bring that out and throw it into the story as it progresses, as you just said.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and there's a lot of different things to this. I mean, the way words and pictures work, and I think a lot of things we're talking about with this is like pacing. Obviously, like we talked about, it can it's actually a good way to slow the pacing down a little bit. It's funny because sometimes you want a slow, quiet moment, but the thing is people can read pictures really quickly. So you might
Mm.
put like more panels in a page with like showing each little tiny moment, but it still takes people really quick because there's no words to read.
Yeah.
So, maybe having more thought bubble stuff in there could help, but at the same time, you might want it to be a quiet moment. So then it's like there's kind of no way to control that situation unless, you do a series of like 7 splash pages, maybe. I don't know, which would be crazy.
Yeah.
But even that, you could go through that really quick too. So it's like, it's really tough to kind of control the pacing sometimes. There's also a few interesting things, there's the typical like old school, like before even the Bronze Age, kind of technique, things you'd see like Stan Lee do a lot of times and a lot of other older writers where you get a panel, and at the top it tells you what's happening in the panel, and in the panel the picture is showing exactly what this says at the top, and the character is saying that they're doing the thing that they just showed. So you have like everything there. There's kind of that, which I think is funny, and it's like there's a charm to it, but it is like annoying if that's what every comic is like. um but then there's like interesting things too, where having a little more narration can actually help you to compress your storytelling. So You could talk about, they talk about, Scott McCloud talks about this in, how, what is it, making comics, where, it's, you might want to talk about, say, like a span of time, and you could be like, well, this person, they were born on this time, and they bought a house on this time, and then they died at this time. Like, you don't have to do, a graphic novel to show that. You could say it within one narration box. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of ways you can kind of compress, especially when you're dealing with shorter, comics, which really, to be honest, most comics are going to be shorter than, your other mediums, because it's just the nature of it. One issue, 24-page issue of a comic is really a small slice of a story, a lot of times. So yeah, I don't know. There's so much to it.
I think we have to remember where comics came from as well. Before the crash of the '90s, where comics were looked at as investments.
Hmm.
Comics were pulp.
Yeah.
They were pulp entertainment, and as such, they were quite quick to flick through. I think in some cases they were wordier. If you just look back at from the 30s through to the 70s, and look at entertainment in general, you look at an old 50s science fiction movie. They quite often started with a narrator. It's kind of putting you in the picture. And that was very much like comics were, and that was the use of the narrator. The narrator in a comic is quite different to the internal monologue of the writer that narrates a novel, I think. It's more descriptive, and it's more, I think it's blunter, to be honest. And you're right, a lot of those early comics were very blunt in their presentation of story. But as we've moved on, and like I say, past the crash of the '90s, comics have become a much more mature medium, and I think people expect more out of it as a medium.
Yeah.
They expect a finer, more refined way of telling stories from comics that maybe comics aren't quite the right medium for.
Mm.
I like the fact that comics are a blunter medium than, say, the the long string of words in prose, or in a novel, or watching a build up in a film. Comics are blunter than that, and actually I like that about them. I liked it when they were pulp, and the thing is because there were no video games in the same way, or even cinema in the same way. It certainly wasn't. You weren't able to consume cinema as much as you could now. Even if, in relatively, the films were still as epic as they are now, there weren't as many, and you didn't get to see them as often. Kids, which is where comics started as far as a mass media entertainment, especially in superhero comics in America. Kids would pick up a pulp comic of, say, Captain America, and they'd read it and read it and read it and read it, and then it would go in the bin. There were very few people that collected them. They were pulp entertainment, and as such, they had that kind of that was the way they were written, much like Saturday morning shows of Batman or what have you, and what's going to happen next week, and there was a cliffhanger, and it's difficult to expect comics to do everything you want out of them. So I think sometimes they need a little bit of leeway. We shouldn't be too harsh on the storytelling techniques,
Mm.
and certainly going back to our point of a narrator, I like narration. I like a box coming in and telling us a small piece of information to help us move the story along.
Yeah.
And I particularly used to like when the editor used to write a little note in a comic and say, "Flick back to issue 6, Ed." I used to really enjoy that because it made you feel like you were kind of in there and understood it. But that was just another aspect of the way that Stan Lee, as editor in chief at the time, just pulled people in. They made the readers almost part of the process of making the comics, or that's the way they felt anyway. So narration is a good tool, I think, in comics.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's funny because I've heard people say like that's they don't like to kind of have comics where they say, well, look at this comic or whatever. But I thought there was something cool about that. Um, you know, I think maybe the kind of the critique with that would be, you know, they don't want to have to read five other comics to understand this
No.
one, but I don't think that's what they're doing in the early comics really as much. It's more, I mean, they are trying to get people to buy more other comics, but at the same time, it doesn't, the story that you're reading didn't depend on,
No.
you going back to those comics. I have just happened this, I was using this for reference for one of my videos the other day, and this is 1968 Action Comics, number 370. And I love the kind of how much words to picture there is, like
Mm.
in this kind of comic. Let me just see if I can kind of open it up to a good sequence. You know, it's kind of, it's not equal, it's not 50-50, but there is plenty of words,
Yeah, there are
but
plenty.
it's not enough words where I feel like it's all words and no,
No.
um and so I want to see the visuals. I want to be excited by the visuals.
Okay.
That's where my happy medium, but not everybody
Mm.
is like that. I'm sure. Now, I haven't read Sandman, but I have a feeling that there's probably a lot of narrative and something like that. The person who was making the comment said they really like the mix in ElfQuest, and I'll be honest, I haven't read that either, and that's one I really want to get to because there's people have said a lot of great things about ElfQuest, so I want to check that out. But they were saying there was a lot of narration in that, which made them able to tell a much bigger story than they could have if they didn't have that narration. But it also kept the pace going really well. So I'll have to look into that. But I do think that it is interesting though. Maybe there could be more narration in comics because I feel like the thing is with a prose novel, you can there's certain things you can do in a prose novel that is hard to do in a comic book if you don't put more narration. Like when you're reading a novel, you can really get the full color of the way somebody's feeling, or what they like, even just walking into a room and this reminded me of this when I was younger, or this kind of all these like the smell of this reminds me of that. Like there's all the novels try to involve every sense, whereas with a comic, um, it does kind of have that pulp effect, and there is a difference between pulp novels and your typical novel that you'd see. I don't know how to explain it, but a more, I guess, respected novel or something. I don't know.
Mm.
So I agree. I personally am the same way. Like I really love the pulpiness of comics. I love that they're kind of disposable, or that was how they were originally intended. Um, and just the fast paced storytelling, and just yeah, I love that kind of thing. But sometimes I do miss, the things that you get with novels, and there's no reason, because we have the ability to have words
Yeah.
and pictures, that we can't introduce some of that into our comics if that's the kind of storytelling we like. I have been thinking of doing a little bit more of that than I typically see in a comic, because I do really like to understand kind of a deeper character sometimes, or understand the environment a little bit more. And I don't think, you know, the thing is I feel like it would be wrong to say this is the correct way to do it, or we should figure out how you're supposed to do it so that then we can move forward. Like, I feel like there's a bunch of different ways you can do it, and I think they're all pretty valid, to be honest.
Yeah.
Um, I do think if I open up a comic and it's 50% words, 50% art, to me, I feel like you're kind of losing the awesomeness of comics there. I do feel like there needs to be a bit of a dance there, and they need to complement each other. That's my particular thing. But other than that, I think that there's no reason why we can't use um, narration to further color what we're doing in the comic. You know.
No, absolutely. There's a definite, as you were saying about putting, say, 9, 12, whatever panels on a page because you wanted to create a series of emotional responses, but there were no words in it. You still have to look and process those panels as part of the story. And then, of course, there's a natural rhythm to the story where more words, more script appears on the page, than at other points in time. I think probably one of the worst things I see is through the modern trend of not having thought bubbles and monologues. So, somebody walks into a room or walks into a situation, and there is a massive monologue about how they feel about something, what they're thinking about themselves, what they're thinking about the situation, the person in front of them, or the villain or whatever, and then they back it up with some kind of memory of their childhood that underpins why they're feeling the way they are. And by the time you've got to the end of the monologue, you're bored stiff, and there's not a lot of room on the page for the art because there's so much text, and you think that could easily have been remedied by a narration and a thought bubble
Mm.
inserted in different places so that you understood this is an internal monologue and is important to the character's private thoughts. This is outward speech where they're talking either to the world or to another character. And this is in the narration box, this is scene setting and possible information about the character and and their environment. And even though it's the same amount of words, technically it's the same amount of information, you split it up. And that in itself, excuse me, that in itself is visual because you split it up by a word bubble, a thought bubble, and a narration box. So even the fact that you're using script, you're using words, you're still splitting them visually. And that aids the visual application of the comic, which is obviously a visual medium.
Yeah.
So I think there's ways and means of doing it, but certainly just like one long monologue from one character is very dull. And I've tried very hard not to do that. There are times when you have to provide exposition, and the only way to do that is to have your character tell some of it. But and then,
Yeah.
of course, like you were saying, if somebody's got history, you can't put a flashback in every time somebody starts talking about the history. Oh, let's do a flashback. It's like, no,
Yeah.
that's dull. Sometimes you have to explain it a little bit. So
Hmm.
I have a book next to me, just like you actually. I've got some Fantastic Four by John Buscema,
Nice.
and you see that's quite word heavy there.
Mm.
That stuff because there's drama, there's interplay between the characters rather than action. And then if we go say to this page, you see this is a lot lighter on text and a lot heavier on action. So
Hmm.
it's exactly what you were saying about that dance between imagery and text. It's got to work, and that's where somebody will come away from, or a reader will come away from a book and be satisfied with it. It's not necessarily that, oh God, that only took me literally 5 minutes to read the physical words that are printed. But
Yeah.
if the visuals also take you in, and the way that the pages are designed and the visual flair that comes with the whole thing, it can grab you and
Mm.
double or treble that read time just because you're engrossed in the book.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, and I think part of the thing with the pacing, it really depends on the reader too. Like, meaning they need to. It's almost a little bit on them, their responsibility to take cues from the pacing that's presented to them, and you know, if they, like for me, I have to like make a conscious decision sometimes when I'm reading a comic to see what I know about comics and try to read it that way. Like instead of just kind of going past a sound effect, maybe read it and kind of either even say it, like kind of
Yeah.
say the sound effect as I'm reading it, or at least think it, and slow down a little bit and don't just zoom past that, because that sound effect is put in there for a reason
Mm.
and it's meant to have a certain effect. So, that kind of thing. Or when I do see a series of panels that I know is supposed to be kind of a slow, quiet moment, take a little bit of time to sit there and
Mm.
and appreciate that. And one way you can help it as an artist is to sometimes, I mean, it depends on your style and how you want to work it, but sometimes in those moments, if you put more detail in there, so one way or another, sometimes that can help because people have more to look at, so they can sit there on a page for a little longer. That only goes so far, but you can try that at least. And one other thing is, you did bring up thought bubbles, and I do have to get going pretty soon because it's shorter
Yeah.
here. But you know, I feel the same way. Like I wish thought bubbles were still in comics more, and I intend to have them more in my comics. But you know, I think having that inner thing is really cool. Like it was cool to, watch Spider-Man swinging around saying all these things while he's fighting, but also thinking something different. And, while he's doing it, worried about, his aunt or something or whatever.
Mm.
Um, Having those thought bubbles is interesting. And the person who brought this up, Sir Handsome, they also brought up this thing that I guess Eric Larson said. I didn't realize this, but he said it was like basically unnatural to have thought bubbles from every single character. Like it's kind of unnatural to know what everybody's thinking and stuff. And I think, yeah, if we're going for realism, that's true. But that's kind of why comics are cool, because you can do that. You have the freedom to do that kind of thing. So, it can go many ways, and I don't think one way is right,
No.
but I would love to see more word bubbles back in comics. That would be cool.
In that case, no film that you ever watch should ever have any internal monologue whatsoever. That should just never happen. You should never have a narrator on any film. And we can all think about films. Forrest Gump, there was an internal monologue from that on occasion, and the other films out there where a narrator has spoken over the top. Wasn't there some short on the Shawshank Redemption as well?
Mm,
He spoke over the top of what was going on.
yeah.
If that's the case, if Eric Larson is correct, then you should never do that in a movie either.
Yeah.
So that's my son and my cat.
Hello.
I'm all for having thoughts, because the whole point is your your book is about your characters and the story they are on. So they would have internal monologues. They would have thoughts of their own, and they're sharing those thoughts with the reader.
Mm,
You've got you're omnipresent as the reader. You're in there. You understand everything, and or you are supposed to understand everything via the delivery of the story.
hmm.
And you are following everybody. That's why you can do a fast cut and go to another scene, because
Mm,
you're omnipresent as the reader. So why shouldn't you understand the internal monologue, internal thoughts of one of the characters? It
yeah.
doesn't make sense to me. So difference of
Yeah.
opinion.
I mean, I think Eric was talking about having the internal monologue of multiple characters a little more,
Right.
um, which is a little, I guess, weird. But like I said, in comics, why not? You have the ability to do that. It's not. It would be a little more weird if you had that in a movie, but in a comic, it's not so weird. There's a lot of things that are weird in other formats that aren't weird in comics. It's just kind of the nature of it. Um, so yeah, I don't know. There's so much to this whole thing. And one thing I did just think of that I didn't think of it until this is, comics are, like we said, a dance between picture and word and picture and stuff. But at the same time, you can have a wordless comic, and it's, to me, it's still a comic, but you can't have a pictureless comic.
No.
That would be a novel. That would be like a
A
book.
very
So that
short one.
so it's interesting, yeah. So it's interesting that like I think it kind of does need to weigh a little bit heavier, at least a little bit heavier on the imagery with comics. At least that's what makes sense to me. I don't I hesitate to really say it has to do anything, but that's kind of the sense I get. um, I just wanted to shout out the chat. Thanks for everybody hanging out. It looks like
Yeah.
Albertosaurus is in here. And thanks for coming in here, and the Art of Read. Uh, and Albertosaurus was talking about how Brian Michael Bendis kind of leans more on the dialogue and maybe not enough pictures. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar enough with his stuff to really know. And then Albertosaurus said that Hush was a really good example of how to
Oh,
do comics with a good balance. And
great book.
again, I haven't read it, but it sounds like Russ likes
Yeah, very good
it.
book. Very good book.
Cool, cool. So thank you for the input, man, and
No
thank
problem.
yeah, man, and oh, Jan just jumped in. Jan, you're late. What's up, Jan? No, you probably were sitting there, but you're just talking now. Spawn used to be overly wordy too. Yeah, I think of X-Men, Chris Claremont. Sometimes he could be, a little bit too wordy on there too. But at the same time, there's, you got a lot of character development in his books and things like that. So, it's just interesting. So many different ways to do it. I do have to get going. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out in the chat. Thank you for everybody watching on the replay. Please put your comments below. I think this is, kind of an open discussion type of topic. I mean, most of my topics are, but, this one really, I think there's a lot more to be said and thought about and pondered and stuff. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about this. Once again, thank you, Russ, for coming on.
No
Where can people
problemo.
find you?
You can find me at russleach.com or comicbookblackbelt.com. I'm as Comic Book Black Belt on YouTube, and I'm on Instagram, leach.russ, and you can find me everywhere: Twitter, Facebook, whole stuff. Sign up to my email list, as I keep getting reminded by Marsh. Sign up to the email list. There's a link at my website, and also on Only Death Can Save Us. That's my book that hopefully will be out next year, that I've just finished the script on. Yeah, you can also pick up the email list there.
Gotcha. And of course, donkeyjawprojects.com is where you can find me, and Marshall Lee _DJP on Instagram and Twitter. And I see that there's another comment there. I would just say, just really quick, Duracell Johnny, it doesn't really matter what genre you pick. Just pick one. Pick the one you want to work on the most and go with it. They're all good. So, do your thing, man. Other than that, thank you everybody for watching, and we will talk to you on the next one.